Robert Higgs, we were just looking at some of your favorite books. One of them is the Holy Bible, King James Version. Why the King James Version?
Because I love the language. I think it's a magnificent work of poetry. And I think even if you're not the least bit religious, you have to recognize that that particular Bible as one that's had enormous effects on not only Western culture, but its language, its turns of phrase. It's just impossible to imagine the past 400 years without that Bible. It's had such a deep and wide effect on the culture of the West.
And H.L. Mencken. Why?
Oh, I love Mencken in every way. Of course, his language is always rousing, and he goes beyond provocative. He's always trying to jab someone. But Mencken, although he's often credited as a rousing writer, I think was actually a very deep thinker as well, and he's not often credited for that. I think he had very much figured out how the world works, and unlike many stodgy professors, he was able to express his observations in a very engaging way.
Do you think that you and H.L. Mencken would agree on political issues?
We'd certainly agree on a great many of them. I don't know whether there's something we would disagree on. There might be, but I think I would have a great deal of agreement with Mencken. I wish he were here today. We need him.
We are back to taking your phone calls with Robert Higgs, our guest for In Depth this month, Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Hi, Professor Higgs. Where to start? Greed basically means wanting or taking more than one needs. But in the business world, you have profit maximization, which means getting as much as you can. And I would see that was even more virulent than greed. Okay, so we go to that sterile environment, and then you add to that the deregulation that started under the Carter administration that allowed for the S&L crisis. And you had deregulation that happened at the end of Carter administration. You had the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the Commodity Futures Modification Act, which allowed for things like Enron and our present crises. What do you think about deregulation?
The more of it, the merrier. I would like to see everything deregulated. Because if everything were deregulated, then there would be a very strong incentive for people to be careful. For example, people wouldn't simply put their deposits in a bank unless they had some information about the safety and the management of that bank. People would not simply buy securities relying on some assurance that the Securities and Exchange Commission has looked over the security and given it some seal of approval. Every time the government regulates something, it creates a false sense of security and leads people to neglect the kind of care that they ought to be giving to the management of their own affairs. Now, of course, when something goes wrong, the tendency is then to turn around and blame it on deregulation, if any has occurred. But this presumes that if we only regulated everything, then the world would be hunky-dory. But in fact, if we regulated everything severely so that we got rid of every risk, the world would be a nightmare. We rely on the fact that people have scope for risk-taking, and we rely on the fact that people will take measures to protect their own interests. And the idea that somehow we can rely on these government employees as if they cared about us as a mother hen cares about her chicks is something that historical evidence shows is verging on a joke. These regulators very often are in bed with the people they regulate, very often looking forward to a lucrative job in the industry they're regulating after they leave the regulatory agency. Very often people who came from the industry they're regulating before serving for a time on a regulatory agency and then returning to the industry. There's a revolving door that's very well documented. And I think it's simply a kind of childishness to expect that we can rely on these overseers in the government to do the right thing and to protect us from behaving foolishly or rationally or unwisely. We can't do that. We know we can't do that from the way the historical events have taken place in the past.
Paul from Tallahassee, Alabama emails in, some government agencies, EPA, USDA, FDA, use methods of calculating the economic cost per estimated life saved to justify economically sensible thresholds of enforcement on public safety issues. Why shouldn't we now insist Homeland Security apply the same method and start estimating the unit costs of measures for saving lives and properties from terrorism and other forms of state insecurity?
Well, I would not consider that an improvement. Homeland Security is something that could scarcely get any worse managed in my judgment, but this might be one way to do it. These agency calculations that purport to use the value of lives saved are extremely controversial at best. In fact, all the kinds of studies that government agencies do to justify their actions are extremely iffy. Besides being a professor, I've been a consultant from time to time over the years in regulatory matters, and so I have a certain amount of first-hand exposure to the sorts of studies government cooks up and relies on and puts forward to justify its policy actions. And I can tell you, you wouldn't want to bet the farm on the intellectual integrity of these exercises. They're shoddy at best, and they're often completely worthless. So in a sense, it seems in the abstract that yes, using cost-benefit studies to decide which government actions are better and which are worse might move us in the right direction. And it's conceivable that occasionally it does, but I have little faith in the ability to divert government from what it's really trying to do, which is help its friends, hurt its enemies, and line somebody's pockets.
And in fact, in one of your books, you take on the FDA. And I can't find it right now, but what do you say about the FDA?
Well, I spent a number of years studying the FDA. It was my major research interest for several years during the mid-1990s especially, and I've followed it to some extent ever since. I think the FDA is probably better than any other government agency. An example of fraud. The FDA purports to use scientific studies and scientific information and scientific decision-making in order to make sure that no one places on the market products, drugs, medical devices, other products that are unsafe or ineffective for their indicated usage. This is something of a joke, and everybody who reads the newspapers ought to know it. Can you say Vioxx? Can you say any number of other drugs that have been approved by the FDA and yet turned out to be immensely harmful? So the FDA's so-called gold standard seal of approval is as bogus as any gold standard seal could get. Again, this has given people a false sense of security. They feel that they're protected when they're really not. But at the same time, because of the incentives FDA bureaucrats have to not place a Vioxx type product on the market, their typical procedure is to be very, very cautious, slow, demand more information, more studies, and as a result, products that are potentially extremely useful and valuable in relieving disease and saving lives are often held off the market for 10 to 15 years awaiting FDA approval. This is a tragedy. It's the kind of regulation that has cost, it seems likely, hundreds of thousands of excess deaths and countless amounts of human suffering in this